the purity fetish prevents an accurate understanding of the world. It prevents you from obtaining truth, but also from building a revolutionary movement. And that's one form of it, right? If we can show working people in the US, here are the successes of the Soviet Union, of China, of Cuba, even while under the boot of imperialist hybrid warfare, that's an extremely powerful argument for socialism, especially today with China. A big chunk of the left, and unfortunately here is not just the Social Democrats, it's also some communists, see a good portion of the working class, specifically that part of the working class that that voted for Trump. They see them as, in the words of Comrade Hillary Clinton, as a basket of deplorables. And that's absurd, because it means that you can't organize them. If we don't do that, one, they're only going to go with the fascists, who are, always a threat when objective revolutionary conditions arise. But two, we end up just being the people that preach to the choir. We have to talk to people who don't agree with us. If we don't talk to people that don't agree with us, or if we shun them out and say that they're unorganizable, we're only going to talk to the same 5 people in our circles. And that's not how you build a mass movement for socialism. So
hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Carlos L. Garrido. Carlos is a Cuban American PhD student and instructor in philosophy at Southern Illinois University. His research focuses include Marxism, Hegel, early 19th century American socialism, and socialism with Chinese characteristics. He is an editor in Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis and in the Journal of American Socialist Studies. His popular writings have appeared in dozens of socialist magazines in various languages. As a political analyst with a focus on Latin America, especially Cuba, he has appeared in dozens of radio and video interviews around the world. He is the author of The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, our subject of discussion today, and also edited and introduced Marxism and the Dialectical Materialist Worldview, an anthology of classical Marxist texts on dialectical materialism. Carlos, welcome to Indian Global Left.
thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. So before we get into your book, if you can just give us a short background of yourself and in particularly what made you interested in Marxism.
Yeah, those I guess those two things overlap, because the way that I saw the book, and specifically the concept of the purity fetish, was as a way of really concretizing my understanding of sort of the trajectory of my political involvement in various parts of the left. But I gotta say, I think I started getting involved in politics, or I started getting the wheels moving with a very personal event, as I think it's the case for most people. You have an event that sort of shatters the everydayness of your life, and it forces you to reflect on some things. And that event for me was when my mother had my younger sister, and she developed internal problems, fibromes, I believe is the medical term. And she was told that if she didn't operate those, she could die. And the question arose, do we operate this and guarantee that nothing bad happens, or do we risk it? But in risking it, but in operating, that would mean putting the family in a great level of debt, because we don't have insurance. And as we know, we live in a country where 60,000 people die a year because they lack medical insurance. Or I live in a country that. So she was faced with this question, and this was very worrisome for me as a young kid. I was maybe 10 or 11, and my whole life I had heard the people around me, as someone who was Cuban but was born in Cuba, grew up in Miami. I heard the Cuban community in South Florida, which is sometimes referred to under the category of gusano, which is actually a category that comes from Jose Marti in his Nuestra America, Our America. He describes the vendepatrias, the people that sell their homeland to the empire, as gusanos de corbata. So worms with a bow tie. But anyways, this community that my whole life, all I ever heard of them when it came to the subject of Cuba was that Cuba was a dictatorship and authoritarianism and political prisoners and a bunch of other things and poverty and how communism didn't work. And so I heard all of this, but then when my mom had this problem, all of her friends and all of the family members, they told her just go to Cuba to get the operation. So I couldn't make sense to that, right? I was already 10, 11 years old. And, what was going through my head was, well, I thought this was the richest nation on the planet with a plethora of resources. And why can't my mom have an operation here? Why does she have to go to this country that everyone spent their whole life criticizing to get the operation? So as I'm my last year of high school, Bernie Sanders starts his campaign and he begins to bring up questions that
This
had
is
not.
2016 campaign?
Yeah.
Okay.
2015, yeah, it starts in
2015, yeah.
2015, right? So
Yeah.
he begins to bring up these questions that were just not really asked in mainstream American politics. The question of, the irrationality of having private incentive in healthcare and education and in various fields. And it clicked, right? That problem that I encountered when I was a young man, not a young man, is still a boy, 10, 11 years old. I was able to start to understand it with the Bernie campaign. So I get involved in organizing with the Bernie campaign in 2016. That is around the time that I'm entering college. In college, I studied philosophy, and I had the pleasure of working with a department where the person that was my counselor in philosophy was like the head of the local DSA. And all the other people I worked with in the political science department and sociology, they were all like very active in the local DSA. So those are the spaces that I started engaging in political practice. And as a philosophy undergrad, you start to read your Marx, you start to read your history of philosophy, your Engels, your Lenin. And I went from the sort of Bernie social democrat to a Marxist. And as I continued working in these social democratic or democratic socialist spaces, I began to have similar problems arise and similar questions arise as to some of the ways that certain things were thought about or certain things were approached. And I felt that there was ways in which the practices that were being engaged in were alienating to the working class. And some of the things that I was engaging with in my reading of what Marxism should be emphasizing, I didn't see it emphasized in these sorts of circles. So that prompted me on the conclusion of my undergraduate studies to start what has now become the Midwestern Marx Institute, along with my co-founder and best friend Edward Smith. And that project that first started as a blog of sorts, it ended up for some reason it's just taking off. He started making short TikTok videos, which I thought was lunacy at the time, but he was making 1 to 2 minute TikTok videos on politics and Marxist theory. And we ended up growing the channel to close to 500,000 followers within a year. That fed into the website, and we developed a big team of people and counselors and professors and activists, longtime activists, who joined the institute and have given it shape. And it's really developed into a broad approach for political education in the U.S., but in a way that engages, of course, at the international level with other organizations and with other researchers from, we have researchers from India, from South America, from various parts of the world. And it's developed into this project that now has not just a website, but a journal, publishing press, the YouTube stuff that we do, social media, and censorship campaigns that have came after us. That I mentioned, that original TikTok account that was banned as soon as the control over TikTok was passed over to the American company. And it was around the time of the beginning of the special military operations in Ukraine. We had the account banned. we made 6 new ones in the course since then, and the 6 new ones have been banned as well. So, but that's the sort of context of my political work. I do a lot of work on the ground as well, but a good chunk of it is related to political education, theoretical education within the Midwestern Marx Institute.
Yeah, this is a very good background because your book, at least as I read it, I saw it having three essential parts, like three components. The first is the philosophical foundation that you begin your book with, and then the question of imperialism, which sort of brings politics with the philosophy and theory, bringing to the fore what our answer should be, our positions, location should be in the Cold War that is going on, in the hot war that is going on, what should be our focus regarding the global south. And so it very directly brings politics to that. And should I say politics of imperialism? And the third part, I should say, is where it goes back to the imperial core, and then it tries to answer that why has some sort of revolutionary or very rapid progressive developments haven't taken place in the US imperial core, and you sort of provide an explanation and an answer towards moving away from fatalism. So let's start with the part two, and I like this is this is sort of disturbing the order of your book, just for the sake of accessibility perhaps. So I'd like to start with the question of imperialism, discuss US, and then wrap it up with the philosophical understanding of what you tried to do. So tell us why you think that an anti-imperialistic um, politics should be at the core of a Marxist socialist understanding or approach to our politics. Why is it so important today?
Oh, how long do you have? There's so many reasons, but I think this is so primary, and this was again I mentioned I think I did earlier there was three central reasons why we ended up starting Midwestern Marx, and one of them was the question of anti-imperialism and the question of how it is that the Western left, or more specifically the American left, views socialist states or even anti-imperialist states that exist outside of the sphere of influence of empire. And an event that very much put in right in my face the anti-imperialist character of the American left was the 2019 Socialism Conference, which I believe I cite in the book in the last chapter, where countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and China were being described as authoritarian and dictatorships, and in the negative sense, right? Not in the more scientific sense of like a dictatorship of the proletariat, but in the more quotidian sense of a condemnation. And I really did not understand that. I didn't understand that. I was puzzled by that when I saw it occur. And the week after that, Ben Noren and Max Blumenthal had published an article showing how some of those speakers were actually funded by USAID, and which is, of course, has been one of the arms of U.S. imperialism under the mask of being a so-called non-governmental organization. So this is a problem.
Sorry, for our viewers, this is the 2019 conference
In
by
Chicago.
DSA, Jacobin, and Haymarket Books. You're
Yeah,
talking.
precisely. Right. So I mean, an organization like DSA, there's been some changes within, like the International Committee has been a lot better in the last year at supporting socialist states. It's at sending out brigades, and I've heard that perhaps there's some tensions with the old cats that are much more in line with what went down in the 2019 and the newer folks. But either way, if there's a common thread in American socialism and in Western Marxism in general, it's the condemnation of socialist states. This is seen through and through. You could trace it back perhaps to the Second International, but you see it in various trends in the Frankfurt School and in the school of Marxist humanism that arises in the West, and in various schools of Western Marxism, that they all reject socialism. And I've as a philosopher, I've had to engage with all of these traditions, and what I have found, and what prompted me to embark on this project of concretizing how it is that these flaws arise through the concept of the purity fetish, was that I saw that in each case, what ends up being the sort of heart of the rejection of socialism is the fact that it doesn't meet the pure standards of what a socialist project must be in their heads to be considered socialist, to be supported. And I have developed this as a purity fetish, as it is an incessant obsession with meeting purity, meeting the ideal standards of purity for as a precondition for supporting or collaborating with something. And this is very clear in the stances that these people have taken with actually existing socialism. And in the US, this brings up a wide variety of paradoxes, one of which is the fact that a lot of these people who condemn socialist states, ignoring the tremendous pressures that these countries that have tried to build or that have built socialism in the global South and East, the tremendous pressure of doing that as imperialized countries that have been under the boot of colonialism and imperialism for 400 years and have been looted and kept intentionally poor to enrich imperialism, the pressures of those historically inherited problems, and then the pressures of imperialist hybrid warfare contemporarily. So it's a world that's still dominated by global capitalism and imperialism, and that makes the sort of socialism that's constructed necessarily siege socialism, as Michael Parenti would call it. It's a socialism that's constantly having to fight off imperialism and collaborating forces within the country that achieved the revolution. So to expect that, to expect these countries to meet the pure standards of abolishing the state, abolishing classes from each according to their ability, to each according to, it's just absurd. It's unrealistic. But that has been the method of analysis that the Western Marxists have taken to, whether it's the USSR, China, Vietnam, Cuba, the DPRK, you name it, Venezuela, Nicaragua. If it doesn't meet these pure standards, I'm going to reject it. And it's when that is the operation through which judgment is passed, you're dealing with something else that's not Marxism. You're fundamentally at the level of worldview, how the world is approached. You're not participating in analyzing the world and judging affairs from a Marxist worldview. You're judging affairs from the worldview that I've labeled the purity fetish, which is grounded very much in not just bourgeois philosophy, but in this long tradition of thought that stems out of the West. I see it. I argue that it is rooted in ancient Greek philosophy, specifically in the debates that arose over the question of change. How is change going to be understood? What's the relationship of the change that we see to ultimate truths? And you have two schools 500 years before Christ. You have the Eleatic school with figures like Parmenides and Zeno, who argue that change is really an illusion. What you have is an indivisible oneness, and truth is tied to that which is unchanging and one. But the way that they think about the one, or the totality, is as undivided. It doesn't allow for internal plurality, internal divisibility, internal contradiction, right? Contradiction and movement, all of that is archetypical of the way of opinion, the way of falsity for them. And as opposed to that, you have the school of Heraclitus, which sees that everything is in constant change, that change is propelled by internal contradictions. And that school is then taken up by Hegel and Marxism. But the other school, the school that looks at things very statically, that is not able to tarry with objective contradictions, that school has basically permeated the history of Western thought. It gets adjusted and it gets readjusted in Plato's thought, it gets readjusted in Aristotle's thought. And pretty much with Plato and Aristotle, you just have certain repetitions of their thought throughout Western philosophy. Famously, of course, Alfred North Whitehead said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, with, I would say, with the exception perhaps of Hegel, who, anyways, that takes us into a whole nother bag of bananas. But the question of anti-imperialism is absolutely central, because imperialism, as the tradition of Marxism that I adhere to, would argue, is the highest stage of capitalism that we have. After capital has fully consolidated and monopolized and become global. And if that is the case, then the struggle that we have to wage necessarily has to be anti-imperialist and internationalist. And we have to realize that the same interests which oppress and exploit American workers are the ones that bomb Iraq, that wage proxy wars against Russia, that demonize China and are setting up a new Cold War with China. It's the same class. It's the same class of monopoly capitalists. So in order to be successful in our struggle here, we have to be allied with the struggles of the peoples of the world. And we have to be, as Che used to say, we have to be cheerful when a struggle in the farthest corner of the planet succeeds. And we have to feel melancholic and down when, in the farthest corner of the planet, the struggle fails. We have to be deeply internationalist. And, from another point of view, the importance of anti-imperialist struggle in the US specifically, it's tied to debunking the great myth that McCarthyism and anti-communism has made people believe in the US, which is that socialism has always failed. It's such an incredibly upside down comment that it has no grounding in reality, because if you actually look at the history of socialist countries, regardless of its flaws, its imperfections, and the difficulties caused by imperialist hybrid warfare, sanctions, and all sorts of attacks, it's been tremendously successful for their massive people. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's given them dignified lives, free education, free healthcare, the basic securities that are necessary in order to live free human lives. And it's done that through empowering that the people themselves are the ones that guarantee this for themselves. They're not like handouts or concessions from the capitalist class. So if we are to succeed in my country, at least what we have to do is debunk this myth. And that's intimately related to defending socialism, defending actually existing socialism, showing our people how it is that socialism has succeeded, and debunking this myth that socialism has always failed. So, anti-imperialism is fundamental, and it's not something separated from the class struggle at home. It's intimately tied to the struggles that we're waging in the US.
One of the things you say is that this Western Marxists, in denouncing the existing socialist systems or previously existing socialist systems, eventually make a case that socialism is worse than capitalism.
Mm.
And regardless of their critique of capitalism, eventually that becomes the lesser of the two evils, and people are eventually persuaded that regardless of how bad our situation is, how unaffordable housing or healthcare or student education be, maybe this is the best we can have, and we can be, at least we can, like, at best we can do some incremental change. So there is a sense of fatalism that emerges out of that.
Yes, yes. Oh, absolutely. They become, Churchill, Thatcher socialists, or Churchill, Thatcher Marxists. Of course, Churchill says that capitalism is the worst system, except for all the other ones. And then Thatcher says there is no alternative, right? Those are the big slogans. And this is what the vast majority of Western Marxists, at least in practice, end up acting as if it's true, because they end up condemning socialism to the point of considering it a far worse alternative to the current capitalist order. And that ends up making these figures agents of what I call in the book a controlled counter-hegemony, or what our colleague Gabriel Rockwell has called the radical recuperators. There's a bunch of different terms that have been used in I think the good part of the Marxist tradition to think about these figures. But in essence, you have a capitalism, especially as it enters its imperialist stage in the late 19th century that is just, it's going into periodic crisis. It's bound every decade to 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 crash and to leave masses of people disenchanted and in horrendous conditions, and naturally that leads to dissenting attitudes. That means that the defense of capitalism ideologically needs to take a completely different form. Like direct apologetics of capitalism is no longer going to work.
Correct.
The projects like PragerU, which are laughably dumb, but the vast majority of people who are watching that from a working class background don't buy that. Like, you watch their Facebook stuff, and the vast majority of the reactions are like laughing reactions, or people commenting, making fun of them. And that's because direct apologetics is not going to work. You need what Lukács called indirect apologetics. You need to present the defense of capitalism as a critique of capitalism. And this is what these figures do, these radical recuperators, these agents of a controlled counter-hegemony. They are the left-wing delegitimizers of socialist and anti-imperialist states that play the role of a sort of tambourine that adds to the melody of the mainstream media's war drums every time that there's a new imperialist war waged on whatever country there is. And what these people do is that when these periods of movement begin, they recuperate. That's why they're radical recuperators. They recuperate that energy that could be siphoned into truly revolutionary areas that substantially oppose capitalist imperialism. They recuperate that into a fold that is pro-imperialist and that doesn't substantially challenge the existing order, all while seeming to be the most radical, right? And that is why it's a controlled counter-hegemony, because it presents itself as if it's actually challenging the ruling ideas, as if it's actually participating in a war of positions against the dominant hegemonic order. But in reality, it is the most indispensable form of solidifying bourgeois hegemony, because when you have a left that agrees that, okay, capitalism is bad, you have these commodities, and this does weird things to be, yeah, but socialism has always been far worse, and socialism means gulags, and it means genocide, and it means poverty, and it means this, and it means that. You know, that's the perfect opposition that the capitalist order needs, and they've become an indispensable component for bourgeois hegemony, and you see it in figures like Zizek and, you know, you name them. Whoever is publishing in the leading journals that call themselves Marxist, coming out of peer-reviewed, the Academy and Index and all the biggest places of the Academy, those are the people participating in that sort of work. And it's done in a variety of other mediums as well. But, you know, we have to realize that this is all intentional. There's been conferences that have been held, and organizations, and the funding of journals and magazines, and the propping up of intellectuals and this compatible left, as the CIA agent Thomas Braden called it. It's a compatible left. It's compatible because it doesn't substantially oppose capitalism. And, you know, I would recommend the work of Gabriel Rockhill that really digs deep into the institutions and material grounds behind what he calls this global theory industry. You know, these what I call the agents that think through the purity fetish and are the agents of a controlled counter-hegemony. It is absolutely propped up by imperialism, and you have the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the middle of the last century that quite literally wanted to siphon the energies that were developing and that were, you know, for peace with the Soviet Union, that were pro-Soviet. They wanted to siphon them into alternative, compatible left routes, and projects like that have continued. They've never really stopped. So that's it's something that we have to fight against, because if we don't, we will continue having the sort of repetition that we've had, where you have mass movements, but then nothing comes of it, you know. And our ruling class is leading humanity as a whole, you know, not just the American people, and it's leading humanity as a whole to the precipice of nuclear Armageddon. and it's extremely scary. It's basically a war against humanity that they're waging. And if we can't overcome these obstacles that are preventing the development of these subjective conditions for revolution, there's a lot on the line. There's what John Bellamy Foster has called the two exterminisms, not just nuclear war, but also climate catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to provide a solution for either of those, or even the threat, the rising threat of fascism and neo-Nazism, the only way to provide a solution is socialism. And to achieve that, we need to, at least in the US, overcome the purity fetish.
In your analysis of the United States, you say that you basically make or diagnose 3 points: that whether there is objective conditions for revolutionary transformations, and you have shown like data is quite clear that there are, with enormous contradictions of wealth on one hand and poverty on the other hand, homelessness on one hand and millions of empty homes on the other hand, and if we can just go on. Building on all those data mining, you have shown that objective conditions pretty much exist. And obviously, we know from all the strike waves and so on that the masses do act. So then you come to and then also you discuss that the ruling elites have been unable to rule as they have been ruling. And this is particularly evident in the international realm, where countries after countries are now, and the
Mm-hmm.
war over Ukraine has accelerated the process. They are moving in a somewhat multilateral world under the leadership or of the PRC. And eventually, you say that the problem with the West, specifically the U.S. left, is that they fail to provide an alternative radical politics that includes history, that includes the working class itself, which is in opposition to a basket of deplorables and so on. So tell us a little bit about, because that's one of your central theses, that the left has been hegemonized by this, what you call as the PMC, the professional managerial class, and you are calling for, at least as I read it, for a working class based left that can give direction to the actions that our society, that the US is otherwise teeming with. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, the PMC character of the left in the US is not necessarily a new analysis. It's been occurring since the 70s. And I quote Barbara and John Ehrenreich, who are the ones that developed the concept of the PMC. And it's important to note that it's around 77, 78 that they developed the concept, because that's that's a period where you can begin reflecting on what happened in the last few decades with the working class, with the development of this middle class, and a process of bourgeoisifying, as Marx and Engels would call it, a part of a relatively large chunk of the working class in the US. And those spaces would dominate the largest portions of the left, with the exception, I would say, at least of the Communist Party in that era. It was still it still had a proletarian character. But this is fundamentally a problem, because you've had the death of the middle class, and you've had this process that my colleague at the Institute, Noah Crashford, calls reproletarianization. This bourgeoisified section of the working class got reproletarianized. And this has been the result, of course, of neoliberal financialization of the last 50 years. But the consciousness is still maintained within the realm of the PMC and the previous era. And that's a problem, because it's fundamentally alienating for working class people. I cite often when I speak about this, the example of Noah, who's a working class carpenter, a member of the Communist Party, and he's been able to convince all of his workers, all of his co-workers, about communism and about the need for a communist revolutionary vanguard party. But then he's asked, why don't you bring them to the club meetings? And his honest response is that it's the atmosphere is very much PMC, right? It feels like an HR meeting or a diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting. And it's got the feeling of, the way that managers engage with workers. And it's a form of relating oneself that is very absent in the way that working class people in the U.S. interact with one another, and that presents a fundamental problem for building a working class movement. But in a way, this last chapter is in some ways really the one that should go first in order, because those three issues are the three that I mentioned that I started seeing as I started developing in the left and developing the Midwestern Marx Institute with Eddie and with others who have helped us collectively think through some of the issues of what's going on. We have everything here to build a revolutionary movement, but it just doesn't get built. What's the fetter that's preventing the development of the subjective conditions? And as you mentioned, I see three. The first one is this topic that we've talked about anti-imperialism. If a working class has been told its whole life that communism means poverty, gulags, genocide, etc., and that communism has always failed, and then the left approaches it and says, yeah, that's all true, but we, the virtuous West, we're different. We're gonna get it right. How incredibly stupid do working class people have to be to say, okay, I trust you. You're gonna get it right. It's always failed, but you're gonna get it right. So it's the purity fetish prevents an accurate understanding of the world. It prevents you from obtaining truth, but also from building a revolutionary movement. And that's one form of it, right? If we can show working people in the US, here are the successes of the Soviet Union, of China, of Cuba, even while under the boot of imperialist hybrid warfare, that's an extremely powerful argument for socialism, especially today with China. just go to China and you can see what a country that is led by a communist party can do with its resources, how it can raise the living standards of 800 million people at the very least, lift them out of extreme poverty, while our country is going down.
Since late 1970s.
Right.
Because a lot were pulled out even prior to that during the Mao era.
Exactly. Yeah. What's often forgotten, people love to juxtapose, the reform and opening up to the previous period, but in that era of the founding of the PRC to reform and opening up, the rise in living standards that occurred was more than had ever been seen in human history. So it was incredibly successful. And in many ways, although there were definitely flaws, in many ways, what's done after 78 is building upon what was done before. In the sort of Kantian formulation, pre-78 was the conditions for the possibility of post-78. But if you can show working class people in the US this success, as they look around and they see their country crumbling, that's an incredibly powerful argument for socialism. So that was one. The second one was that a big chunk of the left, and unfortunately here is not just the Social Democrats, it's also some communists, see a good portion of the working class, specifically that part of the working class that voted for Trump. They see them as, in the words of Comrade Hillary Clinton, as a basket of deplorables. And that's absurd because it means that you can't organize them. They're the agents of the fascist threat, and they become untouchables, right? They're too impure to be organized. Mm-hmm. And what does that leave communists doing besides being, just the people that preach to the choir? Because if they don't have the right social consciousness, and we don't go to them, the more supposedly backward sections of the working class, and lift their social consciousness and take, as Gramsci would say, the kernels in their common sense that are progressive and re-articulate those to socialism. If we don't do that, one, they're only going to go with the fascists, who are, always a threat when objective revolutionary conditions arise. But two, we end up just being the people that preach to the choir. We have to talk to people who don't agree with us. If we don't talk to people that don't agree with us, or if we shun them out and say that they're unorganizable, we're only going to talk to the same 5 people in our circles. And that's not how you build a mass movement for socialism. So you have to be able to engage with all parts of the working class. And that's something that, various organizations in the US left completely dropped the ball on. And it's rooted in the purity fetish. They're too impure. They don't check off all of the list of my enlightened social consciousness. Therefore, we're going to reject organizing them. That was the second one. And the third one is a phenomenon that Georgy Dimitrov had already labeled in 1935 as national nihilism, the rejection of the national past of a country because it's too impure. And for this part of the left, and here you have anything from anarchists to the ultra-left to various communist spaces, America is reduced to settler colonialism, to genocide, to slavery, exploitation, imperialism, and all the bad stuff that capital and the state have done, and that at times a portion of the white working class has, participated in through, what I think is false consciousness. But they reduce America, a social totality that should be seen in movement, that should be seen as containing objective contradictions and various leaps in terms of semi-qualitative leaps, in terms of eras that it has gone through and developed, and internal revolutions it's had. Instead of seeing America like that, which would be a dialectical way of seeing it, they see it as a static entity. They take the bad parts, they treat the bad parts anecdotally as the whole thing, and they end up in this very weird and one-sided understanding of the national past of our country, which ends up then seeing the few progressive movements that they accept as being anti-America or as being outside of America, instead of being, imminent developments of the fact that where there's oppression and exploitation, you'll have struggle. And you have to see it as a social totality. In the underbelly of that ugly history, you have a very rich progressive histories of struggles in the underbelly of the most criminal presidents and generals. You have the history of Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois and Henry Winston and Martin Luther King, and they are as much Americans as the slave owners. You can even say that they're more Americans, because they saw the practices that they were engaging in as being genuinely in line with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. And the late historian Stoughton Lynn, that just recently passed a few months ago, he has this wonderful quote where he explains how it was that the history of the left has been one where they see the ideals of the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, a government of, by, and for the people, and national self-determination as ideals that are only concretizable, that can only be concretized, that are only realizable under socialism. That the logical and practical conclusion of the Declaration of Independence is socialism. And that has incredible potency when it comes to organizing the American people. Socialism, it's not this abstract thing. It has to develop in various contexts. It's a concrete universal. And that means that it always has to take up the characteristics of the places in which it is being developed in. In China, socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Cuba, it means taking up Jose Marti and the anti-colonial tradition. In Venezuela's Bolivarian socialism, you can go down, Pan-African socialism. It has to take up the tradition of its people. And a good chunk of the West, of the American Marxists today, they don't do that. They can't do that because they reject wholly their national past, and they make this very weird, like left-wing McCarthyite move of saying that socialism means abolish America. You spent the whole 20th century, the communist movement spent the whole 20th century fighting against this narrative that in this century is being accepted by a good number of the communists. That only alienates you from your people. When you're talking to American workers and you say, what we're fighting for is abolishing everything you've grown up around and all the traditions that you cherish, the good ones and the bad ones, they're not going to go with you. They're going to laugh you off. They're going to close the door in your face. It's much different to have that approach that's grounded in national nihilism and that really depicts a liberal form of American exceptionalism, because if everyone else has had to do it, but no, we're the ones that can fully condemn our past, that means that we are the exception. We're the American exception to the history of socialist struggles. So it's incredibly important to be grounded in our people's traditions, to understand the American people, the American working class, and to get from that understanding of their common sense and sensibilities, aesthetic sensibilities and emotions, to be able to get the kernels that we can then take and disarticulate from the incoherent worldview that they're in and rearticulate to socialism. That's the basic Gramscian project of the war of hegemony, of developing working class hegemony. So the war of position, I mean. So you can't do that if you reject your national past, if you reject talking to a big chunk of the working class, and if you reject a socialist project. So I see that all grounded in the purity fetish. All of the rejections are grounded on the fact that that which is being analyzed and that which judgment is being passed on does not meet the pure standards that exist in the ideas of these people.
The purity fetish is something that privilege does to you. I mean, you become distant from the real world. You remain inside a bubble for which, by the way, you allow all sort of diversities and contradictions and so on. This is one of the salient features of imperialism. Like every time you discuss an imperial core, or the response, oh, it's a complicated history. But if you have to discuss Cuba or China or Vietnam, it's no more complicated. It's just about the Great Leap Forward. It's just about the gulags and these sort of sweeping categories of authoritarianisms, totalitarianisms, and so on and so forth. So that's something which I guess relates so well to the centrality you have given, even though you haven't innovated the PMC, but you have recognized the centrality of the PMCization of the left, the left organizers moving away and away from real working class, and how that has become a sort of strategically fatalistic, but also historically inaccurate. Like the reality is not in black and white. All right, so I guess we have about 15 more minutes, and as a sort of way to continue our discussion, I have two sort of friendly critique of the book, so as you can take them forward and open up the discussion. And I have one sort of devil's advocate, which I don't necessarily agree, but maybe people would relate to that. So let's start with that devil's advocate, and we round up with my two sort of personal criticism of that book, of your book. So the devil's advocate is that towards the end of your book, or maybe you demonstrate this very well, that we need theoretical education, because throughout the book you're searching for what to do with these contradictions, how do we overcome them, and you are concerned here with the US, particularly US politics, and you advocate towards the end that we need a theoretical education, we need theoretical apparatus, and so on and so forth, and that should be, I assume, is steeped in Marxism. Your critique would say that Marxism has become too theoretical. I mean, categories, I mean, the very central category of dialectic, one would say that today that becomes impenetrable to most working people. So what would be your response to that?
Right. So I don't know if I would say too theoretical in the sense of like a good way of doing theory. It's become just another intellectual commodity. And you see this in the culture of publish, publish, publish. What do you do when you publish? You have to develop new concepts. You have to, cite 1 million people, and that sort of culture that is fundamental to bourgeois knowledge production and to what Rockwell calls the political economy of knowledge has allowed a space for Marxism. And a lot of what has came out of Marxist scholarship in the West has been embedded in that. So it's the sort of thing where you're reading through ideas that are not necessarily that difficult to understand, but that are written in such obscure ways that only 15 people, the 15 people subscribe to the journal and willing to read your article, are the ones that are going to read it. Mm-hmm. And that sucks the living soul out of Marxism, which I see it in a way as embedded very much in the Socratic tradition of philosophy, as necessarily public, dialogical, and engaging with the mass of people. Philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. If Marx was alive now, he'd say that they've only interpreted in journals that 15 people are reading, 15 professionals specializing in the same niche field. So I do think that there's a way of, there's the need for theoretical clarity. because we've had great movements arise in the last 20 years. The movement against the war in Iraq, Occupy Wall Street, the Bernie Sanders movement, and the correlate movements of that, the George Floyd protests, which got anywhere from 25 to 35 million people in the streets, the highest, number of people that have engaged in mass protests in U.S. history. You've had these movements, but nothing has really came out of it. Out of each one, literally nothing came out of it. So you have to ask, well, what gives? Why is this the case? And I think that they have all lacked ideological clarity and an organization that can shift that energy into a revolutionary direction. And to do that, you need theory. You need to have a systematic understanding of the issues that people face at an everyday level, and a way of thinking about how to move forward. And that doesn't mean engaging with these extremely obscure texts, or forcing working class people to like read Hegel or Ilyenkov or something. It's the sort of education that you would give to like a cadre member, and to regular working people is, I would imagine, different. But we do need theory, and I do think that the basic tenets of Marxism, and which is at its core the class struggle, is very easily understood by working class people. I teach in Carbondale, which is, last time I checked, the poorest place in Illinois. And all of my students, diverse backgrounds, Black, white, Hispanic, very diverse backgrounds. And they all come from poverty and the working class. And every time I teach Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, Che, they just get it. They just get it. The common phrase is, this just puts words in what I've somewhat known or have been feeling for a very, very long time. So that's what I think successful theory does. And although I do a call for that in this book, where I really develop the dialectical materialist worldview as the way we should adjust our thinking to approaching reality, is in the other book that I had published previously, the anthology, where I write a long introduction providing a comprehensive understanding of what dialectical materialism is, and then I bring together 15 authors from the classical Marxist tradition, all of their writings that are centered on analyzing what dialectical materialism is and why it's a more successful way of viewing the world, both in the field of the sciences, hard sciences, and social sciences, but also in terms of analyzing geopolitics and analyzing the struggles and basically everything. The place that Marxism has developed the most, in my view at least, has been in China. Incredible developments have been coming out of the Chinese Marxists. And their big thing is seeing it as a worldview that you can apply to literally everything. And that everywhere you take the dialectical materialist analysis, you will be able to better understand things in that field. So I don't think that I don't think that the two things are mutually exclusive. We need to move away from the way that Marxist theory has been done up to now, which means removing the purity fetish and adjusting a dialectical materialist view that gets to the masses. And we try to do that at the Institute, from anything from 2-minute TikToks to interviews and streams. And now we're going to start doing classroom setting, sort of university stuff that we have planned down the line. So, yeah.
One of the things that struck me when you were saying is, like, I was trained as an engineer, and right from my engineering days when I was studying, we would go to construction sites to, make estimates or study different aspects of engineering. And in one of those conversations, in fact, that turned out to be many later on, I would often talk to the workers there, and they would say, this is in Calcutta, in India, and they would tell me that, look, we are building this building, but who do you call is the builder of this building? It's either the government or the contractor or these big sort of multinational corporations or engineers like you. And I hadn't read Marx's Capital Volume 1, Labor Theory of Value back then. But it just sort of, in an instinctive way, it touched me, and I felt that this is right. Like this is all the labor is then congealed, what Marx would say, as something which is a form of value. And later on, when I was reading Marx, I felt that labor theory of value is sort of, it comes out of the working class instincts that is based on a reality. So in that sense, I guess theory and practice has a very deep connection and they are rooted. So that is something I guess we lose out with the sort of PMCization of our political base. And then there is a small question of dejargonizing theory even within the university itself. That's perhaps a smaller question, but that's also something where philosophy and you know that has become so jargonized at times, or maybe training has been so de-democratized that people just can't understand them.
Well, it's done for the sake of putting people on tenure track, not
Obviously,
for the sake of, helping people understand the world better, or helping people, build a revolutionary movement. It's done to get people on tenure track, to let them know what journals have the best impact factors, how can you adjust your writing to fit in there. And, I've mentioned a few times already, Gabriel Rockhill, he was in that intellectual milieu in France. He studied with Derrida and all the leading French thinkers, and he was publishing in the best journals and books and all that stuff. And the war in Iraq came, and he's like, well, I've read so much of the shit, but I don't understand with this worldview what the fuck is going on. I can't understand anything. And then he picked up Lenin's imperialism, and he's like, oh, now I
that makes sense.
understand. So it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and it's its own. That's not to say that there isn't quality work that's done in
Right.
parts of academia, right? But it's it's its own thing that's separated from the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of changing the world. And that's why, at its core, I repeat it a few times in the book, the purity fetish not only prevents you from acquiring truth, which is tied, in my view, to a proper dialectical materialist analysis of the world, but it makes you revolutionary futile. So it's a problem both of theory, understanding the world, and of practice, changing it.
Right. One of the important things that you just said is, and I just want to stress it, is that that doesn't mean that there is no good content
Right,
in
right, right.
the theory, because that's the other side of what bothers me. Like people have stopped reading, like, and just condemn, like, and this is something that has to do with the larger world of social media. Like
Oh, yeah.
you just, and that relates to the purity fetish. Like, so and so has done this wrong, so I'm just shunning him or her. Like I'm not reading anything that person has to say. So that is sort of part of that problem. We also had Gabriel Rockhill, and if you're watching this video, do check out that interview as well. But okay, to now come to not the devil's advocate, but my own to criticism. Um, so in your analysis uh, the of the anti-imperialistic or anti-imperialistic of Western Marxism, you completely succeeded, and I do feel the same. And there, I guess you succeeded. What I would have liked to see more in the book is a dialectical or a more sensible, let's say, not use a jargonized phrase, is a more sensible way to approach. And maybe that's not your goal, but I'm just saying that why this book sounds like the audience is Western in your own mind. You're addressing to a Western society and not necessarily someone from China, because the question comes to mind is that how do we approach our world in a more critical manner? So, someone in Cuba reading this book would relate to everything you said about imperialism, about sanctions, and about running terror campaigns and so on and so forth. But in your book, there isn't much about how they can critically look at their own society. So while you do a tremendous task, for instance, in China to uh, defend the opening up during 1978, saying that if you don't do that, it's a capital scarce region. You are damned anyway if you don't do that, because you fail to develop productive forces because you lack capital. And then you can say, look, the Soviet Union is so underdeveloped that people have to stand in lines for an automobile that you can buy here. So that is on one side. On the other hand, if you open up capital and bring foreign direct investment, you'd be condemned by saying that, oh, you are capitalist. So you were very successful in that, but you failed to address, for instance, the loss of jobs that came with the destruction of the state-owned enterprises in the 1990s, like roughly 50 million jobs. And this is Joel Anderson's book I'm drawing on. And even today, you talk to my friends from China, you speak about the Cultural Revolution and so on and so forth. So you leave that critical framework open. I'm not saying you are foreclosing that, but you never discuss anything of that sort. So I was just thinking what your response to this critique be, or perhaps I'm coming from a global south perspective
Right.
to just clarify my own critique of that book.
I appreciate the critique, and it's one that uh, Comrade Greg Goddles, who's from the Marxist Marxism-Leninism Today online journal, he asked me in the first interview I did on the book, specifically related to how in that period Chinese foreign policy was was far from perfect, and the projects that were supported, and in part one of the things that Carlos Martinez, who's another friend and I think tremendous scholar on China, one of the things that he shows is that in part the breathing room that China had that allowed it to develop as peacefully was not unrelated to the fact that it didn't have to, as the Soviet Union did, spend so much resources protecting imperialized nations from imperialist attacks. And that's definitely true. And, part of, there's going to be a lot of things that are left out, in part because this is a book that is very much focused on thinking what is wrong with the left in the West, but specifically in the US. Why have we continued to fail even as objective revolutionary conditions couldn't be any riper? So that's the aim, that's the question I'm really trying to tackle. And in the process of
And that's
tackling,
the third part of your book.
right,
That's
that's
where
the
you eventually end.
right, because I have to I felt like the condition for me being able to do that successfully would be me grounding what I'm
Absolutely.
looking at as an ideological flaw
Yeah.
in the history of Western philosophy, and then in the history of Western Marxism, where I touch on Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Zizek, who are not in the U.S. So I think that those questions are good, and that the purity fetish. And this was a comment that was we did a book launch yesterday, and my the person who we co-founded the Midwestern Marx Institute with, he made a wonderful comment, which is that as opposed to thinking that the purity fetish prevents one from being able to criticize socialist states, the contrary is true.
Absolutely.
Without the purity fetish,
Right.
it's when you can criticize without condemning and without fully excluding support for these struggles. And at its core, the purity fetish critique is a call for the return of a dialectical materialist analysis to Marxism. And that means that we have to see contradictions. And there's going to be contradictions in socialism. There's contradictions everywhere. That's what propels change, and change is incessant. So there's a lot of contradictions that socialist countries have had that we can fairly try to address in the form of comradely critiques. I think the archetype here would be, the critiques that Che levied against certain forms of economic practices in the former Soviet Union. It was done splendidly well. Never condemned the Soviet Union. It was very comradely. We can definitely do that. I find, however, that unfortunately, a lot of people that try to do that in the West, they do it in a very superficial manner because they don't ground their analysis in the debates that are already going on in these countries. No one knows the flaws of China better than their Chinese Marxists. No one debates their flaws and their contradictions and how to move forward better than the Chinese Marxists. The same goes with Cuba and with every other socialist experiment, because self-criticism is fundamental in order to develop and protect the revolution, which is, I believe, the central task that all of them are embarking on, regardless of the different schools that they're coming at it from. So this critique that can be levied towards socialist states is both necessary in order so that the current contradictions can be sublated, so they can be overcome, but it has to be grounded on an understanding of these debates. And I'm not against, I'm not at all against that, but in my country at least, and although I'm very interested in these debates and I follow the Chinese journals, and in my country, at least in the US, the atrocity propaganda on China is just absurd. So the emphasis has to be laid on debunking that atrocity propaganda that's aimed at hitting our sentiments, right? If there was a Uyghur genocide, man, that would make you feel horrible. As communists, part of what we have is a deeply humanistic ethic that feels genuinely bad whenever there's even one life lost in the farthest corner of the world. And if that was really going on, we'd be torn. So they play on our sentiments in order to get us to support imperialist attacks and atrocity propaganda. And in that context, the emphasis of our discourse in the US on China has to be support, has to be debunking myth, emphasizing the positive. And then later amongst comrades, we can talk about, some of the negatives. But the context of the critique is very different, right? So.
Now that's a good answer. And I mean, just to qualify, I guess I would have not even posed this question if I regarded your book just as a book of political strategy. I mean, then we don't even have to deal with that. We don't have to lecture China, as you said, like China, no one understands their contradictions than themselves. But I guess why I asked this question is that your book also has a theoretical value, which is of how to approach the world. You deal with that very centrally, the basic fundamental problem with the world view itself. And there are these, and there comes that question, like someone reading this in Kerala in India, for instance, where the Communist parties rule, or someone in Cuba and China, that is something that struck me on one hand, and on the other hand, someone very interested in economic history and the contemporary of China, for instance, I often think about a very difficult situation. For instance, think about that the PRC is now one of the leading sovereign creditors in the credit market. Now, obviously, there is a huge amount of propaganda, about the debt trap, for instance. In Sri Lanka, it is said that as if it's only the Chinese sovereign money that went, while the reality is that just 15% of them. But going forward, as more and more surplus gets accumulated in the sovereign bank, some of them would go into true credit. And now imagine a country want to default or seek for a moratorium. Now, because the Chinese state would be acting in a credit market, the private players, be that Chinese business itself or the institutional investors from the West, would impose sharp limitations on Chinese state itself to allow the default or the moratorium itself. So these are like real problems that the state faces, and so that was the sort of ground I was coming from. But I
Right.
guess you did.
And is China perfect? Right? No. And we shouldn't use its imperfections to condemn it as the Western Marxists do.
Right.
We also shouldn't, in order to support it, assume that it's perfect. Which means that part of removing the purity fetish is not just being able to support, but being able to participate in this comradely form of critique, which I think has to be informed with their thinking process and with a dialectical view of the fact that China is a process. It's in constant development. The Xi era is a continuation of the previous eras, but in many areas, a break with certain practices of the past. If you read Roland Bohr's book, Socialism and Chinese Characteristics, the wild 90s were wild. And then the early 2000s, you could go up to any random CPC member and they wouldn't know a lick of Marxism, right? Those are things that have changed under the Xi era, and they couldn't have changed without that internal critique, right? That self-criticism that's absolutely fundamental. So yeah, I would agree with I don't know if that would count as a criticism if I agree with you, but
Yeah, that's why I said like a friendly critique. And this, if your time permits, like I would just like you to ask the last question, which is
yeah,
a
yeah, of
even
course.
milder critique. And this is something maybe like if I was a reader or reviewer of your book before publishing, like I would have suggested that it's not a sort of major framework critique, but I felt like towards the end that you're dealing with like who these Western Marxists are when you are talking about them, right? So when one reads the book, one finds very concrete examples, the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, and you have given Marcuse his due place, like that he was very different in a sense from Adorno and Horkheimer, who were just blanket criticism of the Soviet Union, but never, and that was a very good analysis. So Zizek, um, Adorno, Horkheimer, you name them and it's a very concrete analysis, but then there are also these moments where there are one is the reader is left somewhat guessing, like when you discuss on the same breath the basket of deplorables. We are talking about Hillary Clinton, not Western Marxism. You are also dropping like the problems with the ultra left. That's what you use, like some ultra left who would say that, oh, Western or US history, there is no class struggle or nothing like that. This is something which in the European context would be how the British Marxists would, prior to E.P. Thompson, would treat British history, that this is just bourgeois democracy, and it is the France, where there is class struggles and socialist traditions and so on and so forth, for which Thompson had to write that magnum opus. So you are both concrete in these cases, but at times one is left to think whether Carlos is talking about university intellectuals like the Frankfurt School or the Cuba or sorry, American Communist Party, or the grassroots worker, or the liberals like the mainstream Democrats and so on and so forth. So this is just the sort of my observation, and I would like your response to that.
That's a good point. And I would have, in part, this book, it was asked from the other folks at the Institute for it to be done and for it to be short, a very readable book. I think it's like 104 pages. And I was able to complete it within a matter, I think, of around 2 months. So uh, if it would have had, if its purpose would have been to be something larger, that section I think would have had a lot more concrete examples of what are the specific agents that I'm talking about. But I do reference, as I'm making the moves of the three central ways that the purity fetish manifests itself, I reference tendencies in the US. Because again, I see the central audience really as the US. And although I've talked with certain British comrades and they've affirmed that the flaws have manifested themselves over there, when I make those moves, part of the assumption is the people reading, because they're in this struggle, they're in the American left, and they once you've been in it for at least a few months, you understand the different tendencies. They know who it is that I'm referring to. So specifically, like, just to drop some names, I bring up the assessment of a part of the working class as settlers. This is concretely, it comes from this book from Jay Sakai, who God knows who that guy is. There's certain accounts that just say he's a CIA, asset. There's no actual person, or there's other accounts that say he's an anarchist. He's a real person, but it's a pseudonym. I mean, I don't know who the hell he is. But his book, The Settlers: The Myth of the White Proletariat, blew up in the U.S. And it just happened to blow up right when the these conditions have been intensifying, right? You have people from the Communist Party reading it and sharing it and telling you that if you want to understand the US, you need to read this book. You have that occurring in other parties, and some members that were PSL, some DSA members, and practically most of the other like Maoist organizations, because the analysis is very much in line with a certain form of third world Maoism. So for that analysis, that one, that's directly the person that I had in mind. Connected to that, you have the work of Gerald Horne, who, although I think he's done a lot of good stuff, especially before the overthrow of the Soviet Union. He had a great book on Du Bois, and I'm currently doing a work on Du Bois, and I draw somewhat heavily on that book. His analysis of the U.S. as settler colonialism, I find it to be profoundly undialectical, and it's blown up in the left. It's blown up in the left, and a lot of my very good friends and people that we've collaborated with continue to have this analysis play somewhat of a central role in their understanding of current affairs. And I do mention him, but I do it in a footnote. And he's someone who I've from what I've seen, he's got the right position on China and Russia and a lot of issues, 99% of the issues. So I didn't want to condemn him fully. And I felt like, in part, when I engage in these critiques, the people that I want as targets are people who I think in part are condemnable. Not that they can't change, but a lot of the people that I left out, specifically in the analysis of the U.S., I think they can change. And I don't want to be condemning them too directly. When part of what the influence that the book has had has been in some of these figures realizing that some of those mistakes that they were making, and reflecting on them and seeing, whether they can change on them or not. So, yeah, there's in one way, I assume, since the main target of the book is American Marxists, even though it has this general character and this general theoretical analysis, I assume that those movements are understood by the American communist reader. But ideally, I could have been a little bit more concrete in who it was that I was referring to. There's also, party politics stuff that that gets in the way. But yeah, I appreciate your criticism. It's well taken.
This is just at one moment it struck me when you wrote, for instance, that the leftists or you said Marxists would treat the working class almost as the same way as a Hillary Clinton would treat. And I take your sort of broad point that even within the Marxists, and that has to do with the centrality of PMC, there is this tendency which should be very sharply in contrast to if we look at Italian, reform council formations in 1920s and so on. But within that same context, it's somewhat, it needs hashing, about how a Hillary Clinton looks at the working class and a Western communist, like a communist party member of US, despite the problems that you have just convincingly outlined. I guess there are differences. So that was something that. All right. So this was a wonderful conversation. I just wanted to give you the last word on this question that I have. What do you think about these small platforms, let's say on YouTube, that are coming up globally, that perhaps have 10,000 subscribers? People like Radhika Desai, they are doing great work from the International Manifesto Group, Midwestern Marx. We are trying to come up, and there are a bunch of them. Do you see there is a potential to sort of do some sort of collaborative work going forward? And if that aligns with the vision that you have outlaid in your book, and that would be your concluding statement.
Oh, absolutely, man. And it's so important today, right? There's this tendency, and I think, no offense to the old heads. I love the old heads. I'm one of my best friends. He's 81 years old. I talk to him for hours on end. But there's this tendency in some of the old heads to undermine the role of, either social media or these different online media platforms. And that's very unfortunate because a good number of the hours that people live are spent on the internet today. And that's just, you look at statistics, 7 to 8 hours is the average time that an American spends on their phone and on social media. So it has become a site of ideological warfare. It's become an ideological field where, like any other, the war of positions has to be waged. Mm-hmm. And it's waged in, in the ways that we've tried to do it on the Institute. It's waged in the ways that you're doing it, in the ways that other projects are doing it. You mentioned Radhika Desai, and she's got an awesome show now with Michael Hudson and the Geopolitical Economy Report. So I think collaborations are going to be fundamental. We did the book launch for the Purity Fetish yesterday, and it was a collaborative effort with the International Manifesto Group and the Critical Theory Workshop of Gabriel Rocco and Jennifer Ponce de Leon and our institute. And more things like that would be really good. We, as far as the International Manifesto Group, our institute is an affiliate of them, and last I heard, they would like to serve as the sort of center of an international way of connecting different groups of our character in becoming affiliated with one another and learning from each other's struggles, and in fighting for a common anti-imperialist and socialist cause, which is what we all have in common. Even like the small differences that we have, they're pale when compared to what we have in common. And this is even true of various Marxist tendencies on the left. We have a lot more in common that we have in difference with one another, and we'd be a lot more successful if we can unite. And of course, there's certain things that break principles and that make it hard to unite, but we're going to have to, I think about in our era how to make networks, how to make these connections that are going to have a very online character while obviously needing a non-online character. How to make these connections is going to be fundamental in the process of understanding that, at the ground, we have to organize the mass of people. So I think collaboration is so fundamental, and from the start, we've tried to collaborate with as many people as possible, and we have the sort of approach to the world where we always like to emphasize what is really, really good in various projects and leave the bad part to comradely critique, right? So in our institute, we have people from the Communist Party, from the PSL, FRSO, DSA, PCUSA, all the organizations in the country. And it's been, or what we've tried to do is sort of build, I don't know if an archetype is the right word, but a model of political practice that is able to go beyond some of these accidental differences, and that focuses on the substantial unity that these people have across different organizations. So yeah, I think it's fundamental. The difficulty with the online topic, and this was a question that we brought up yesterday, was at any moment we can get censored. If Indian Global Left gets to 500,000 views, you can expect that well before then, you'll probably get censored. The same thing with us. That's what happened with us through TikTok. We got to 400,000. We were getting videos consistently every week in the millions of views. And then boom, as soon as the proxy war against Russia started, we questioned the narrative and we got banned. And every time we made a new account, we would build it up to tens of thousands, one of them to a couple 100,000 followers, and then banned again, and banned and banned and banned. And that's countless hours of work, just down the drain. And the community that was able to be created at a relatively large scale just completely destroyed. And, we haven't had our account banned now, I think in a month and a half or 2 months. And you know, every day we post a video, and if it goes a little bit viral, you have people in the comments, "Oh my God, where'd you go? Where did you guys go?" Right? I'm glad to have found you guys again. It's very difficult. It shows that if we're able to do that with the TikTok, that at a large scale, the vast majority of people are ready for this message. But the mediums through which you reach this mass of people, because they're controlled by, you know, the bourgeoisie, they can pull the rug under you at any moment, whether it's Twitter, YouTube, anything, right? And even if you create an alternative social media thing that respects free speech for comrades or something, it'll be found in bourgeois search engines, which will suppress it. So that's a definitely a quagmire, and it emphasizes the importance of thinking about the ideological struggle in these fields dialectically, and as although necessary, not sufficient. It forces us to remember that the key is to do stuff in the ground, in our workshops, and in our communities.
Carlos, thank you very much for this wonderful time we had. And I think this is the sort of beginning of a future collaboration that we look forward to.
Absolutely. We would be happy to.
Have a nice day.
Thank you, comrade. You
Take
too.
care. Yeah.